Let me start by running you through the background paper, which you can find in your packs. The paper itself will provide a framework for discussion in both the buzz groups and the workshops that will follow later in the day. Then the workshops will feed into a chaired plenary discussion where we will work towards a practical vision for taking impact assessment forward in the sector. So the aim of today's meeting is to better understand the nature and use of impact assessment in the humanitarian sector, and then use this understanding to define a practical vision for future work. The paper itself has three main parts. It begins with a short background section on the driving forces that have shaped impact assessment in the humanitarian sector. It then describes 6 key areas that have presented us with very particular kinds of challenges. And this is followed by conclusions. Next slide. So let's start with the background. We all know that humanitarian work has rapidly expanded and changed over the past 25 years, especially in the 1990s, where we witnessed an unprecedented number of complex emergencies in Somalia, Southern Africa, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Central America, Kosovo, and East Timor. We also know that our humanitarian scholars have written about the dangers about humanitarian principles, and we heard that just 2 minutes ago from the ambassador, humanitarian principles such as neutrality and impartiality that have become compromised by becoming entangled with political and strategic agendas. The very aims of humanitarian action have become blurred. It's now not just about saving life. Organizations and individuals have diverse views about what we should be doing, and that means that the notion of humanitarian impact is not a given. Intended impacts will be different things according to what one wants to achieve in the first place. And all of us know that our industry has become more institutionalized than ever before, with the development of codes of best practice, standards, compliance mechanisms, evaluations, and so on and so forth. And this has created a culture of setting targets and achievements, often in quantifiable terms. The jury is still out, I think, as to whether this has improved or will improve the end result of humanitarian action, but it's certainly provided an environment which legitimizes and promotes the concept of impact assessment as a means of finding out. And finally, the number and scale of emergencies has increased dramatically over the past 20 years, and we're now seeing more efforts in trying to predict the numbers and kinds of emergencies that will happen in the future. Now, meeting all of these challenges requires good knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. And as a result, many people are calling for better impact assessment to provide answers. So let's have a look at the progress that we've made so far. Now, the background paper outlines 6 key areas which, taken together, will give us a pretty good picture, I think, of where we are. So the 6 areas are defining impact assessment, diverse stakeholders and interests, indicators, baseline and data methodologies, collective interpretation and analysis, and capacities and incentives. So let's begin with defining impact and impact assessment. The aid community has tended to view impact as a kind of linear results chain. Now we can see from this flow diagram that it all looks very neat and tidy. Inputs produce outputs, which produce outcomes, which create an impact. And this moves one towards one goal. Now, as the theory shows from the slide, the Millennium Development Goal is universal primary education for all, but the reality is rather different. In fact, universal primary education is only going to be achieved at present rates of progress in 2079 in sub-Saharan Africa and in 2036 in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the point I'm making here is quite simple. The real world is a complex place that fights against being reduced to a straightforward model. For example, the picture on the left shows the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914. Now, if we apply our linear model to this, we see that the activity is to kill the Duke. The output is the gun firing, and the bullet going through his neck sorry, the output is the gun firing and the bullet going through his neck simultaneously, and the outcome is that he dies. The impact, however, could never be guessed by anyone at the time. In terms of human life lost on the battlefield, the First World War that followed was the worst in human history. And similarly, when asked what were the implications of the 1792 French Revolution, Chairman Mao took stock of the question and famously answered, "It's a little too soon to tell." Some people, therefore, prefer to look at contribution rather than attribution. This more modest perception recognizes that impacts are the results of many different stakeholder inputs as well as many contextual variables. Now, a widely accepted definition of impact assessment stresses the fact, sorry, I'll wait till this, this slide eventually evolves. A widely accepted definition of impact assessment stresses the fact that impact can be both positive or negative, and that the aim should be to provide an analysis of lasting or significant changes in people's lives. But this is still not easy due to the peculiarities of humanitarian action. As I've alluded to in the introduction, there's still a lack of clarity around the definition and purpose of humanitarianism. Humanitarian contexts are often defined by rapidly changing events, and the intended impacts of the intervention are often unclear or overambitious. Now, common sense tells us that impact assessment is going to be more difficult in humanitarian contexts than in the development world. Now, we'll hear much more about this from Elliot later, but as a prelude to Elliot's presentation, we can see from this overhead that there seem to be marked differences. Now, in essence, the development world should allow more time for planning and should provide a more stable environment for assessment than in the kind of crisis situations that humanitarians work in. Now, the second area of our 6 areas, is diverse stakeholders, interests, and objectives. Now, the humanitarian sector has changed a lot since the days of Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, and Marcel Junot, the celebrated ICRC doctor. They lived in a less crowded world than we do, and dealing with diversity is an issue, of course, that we're all familiar with, but it also has important implications for impact assessment. The trick, I think, is to find ways of letting different stakeholders express divergent views and make sure that the findings from impact assessment meet the interests of end users. And I think this is fair to say rarely happens. Balancing different needs and views is tricky. Experience has shown us that there's a tension between proving past impact and making things better in the future. And we've found yet again that there seems to be a tension between how to balance the accountability and learning aims of impact assessment.